The moon had been a thin coin over the Caribbean, and the surf at Playa Girón carried the thud of engines before any watchman saw the boats. Near midnight, April 16, 1961, blacked-out landing craft wallowed toward the Cuban shore, while men in new fatigues gripped rifles and whispered the names of streets they had not seen since exile. Far out, B-26 bombers flew racetrack patterns and waited for dawn and orders that kept changing. On the beach, a lantern winked once and vanished. Then tracers stitched the sky and the invasion began. For 2 years, a plan had traveled Washington rooms where maps lay under coffee cups and language lost its edges. Eisenhower's people designed it, the CIA refined it, and a young administration inherited it like a locked briefcase full of costly choices. The hope stayed simple and endlessly rehearsed. Land a brigade of Cuban exiles, seize a beachhead, spark an uprising, and usher in a friendly government. The plan carried neat labels: Operation Zapata, Brigade 2506, and a careful promise that the United States would not be seen. The men chosen called themselves brigadistas. They trained in Guatemala and on a Nicaraguan strip, learned the temper of the B-26 and the weight of rubber boats, and practiced on beaches that looked nothing like home. In Miami, families waited and pretended not to know. In Washington, caution shaved the plan. The original scheme had aimed at Trinidad, a town nearer mountains and descent. Politics moved the arrow west to the Bay of Pigs, a lonelier coast where secrecy seemed safer and support harder to summon. The change looked small on a map and large in the world. Air power was meant to clear the way. On April 15th, 8 B-26 with Cuban markings struck at dawn, knocking down planes and cratering fields while headlines shouted "Yankee" across the hemisphere. The United Nations filled with microphones. Kennedy, wary of a public fingerprint and of open war, canceled the second strike designed to keep Cuban jets grounded during the landings. That decision traveled by wire and doubt to the ships already underway. The men read it as fate and rowed anyway. The flotilla reached the bay in darkness and confusion. A reef lay where charts had promised depth, boats grounded and backed, while men waded with packs over their heads. On the beaches at Playa Larga and Playa Girón, militia and regulars gathered faster than the planners' papers had imagined. Castro drove south in a combat jeep, and anti-aircraft guns sprouted along the road. At first light, the exile pilots finally came in low, brave and precise, but Cuban T-33s and Sea Furies clawed the sky and hit hard. Supply ships burned, ammunition cooked off and turned decks into brief suns. A radio operator on the beach counted explosions and said a prayer between numbers. Brigade radios filled with appeals that stacked into a single plea: air cover. The American carrier beyond the horizon could not launch fighters under rules set in Washington. On the third morning, a compromise sent unmarked B-26s from Nicaragua, but they arrived late, met trained Cuban pilots, and fell in bright, useless deaths that mixed exile crews with American airmen whose names stayed quiet for years. Back on the sand, men counted their rounds and felt the tide creep toward their ankles. Tanks rumbled down the road. Mortar shells learned the map. For a day, the brigadistas held crossroads and an airstrip with a steadiness that would later feel like accusation. They knocked out armored cars at close range, shifted machine guns to meet flanking attempts, and dragged wounded into mangrove shade choked with mosquitoes and salt. But every hour made the arithmetic worse. Ammunition ran dry. Unloaded crates held medical kits instead of bullets. Sea dumped others into shoals. When units tried to pull back along the single road out, they met roadblocks and fire. The swamp waited on both sides, patient and deep. By the night of the 18th, the beachhead had shrunk to a scrap of sand and scrub. Messages grew short and personal. One unit reported simply, "We are destroyed." Another asked that the world tell their families where they fell. The sea offered no rescue. Orders ashore forbade American warships from crossing the line that would turn a covert failure into a declared war. A few men swam out and were plucked up by crews who stared at their hands and said nothing. Most hid in mangrove until hunger pushed them toward the muzzles and the notebooks. At first light on April 19th, the last coherent pockets stopped firing. Brigade 2506, those who lived, stepped into captivity on a road lined with cameras. The battle had lasted 3 days. It felt shorter and longer both. Roughly 1,200 prisoners filled makeshift pens and then Havana jails. More than 100 men lay dead along the dunes and the swamp edges, their names carried home in folded letters. In Havana, Castro staged victory with the ease of a man who understood theater. He toured the battlefield, stood atop captured tanks, and told crowds that the revolution had shattered a Yankee plot. In Miami, radios went quiet, kitchens filled with unspent prayers. In Washington, the president met a hard truth faster than most leaders ever did. Kennedy stood before his people and took the blame that the bureaucracy would have shifted. He praised the courage of the exiles and, privately, ordered a review that bent toward reckoning. The reef, the canceled airstrikes, the assumptions that never met the shore. The shock traveled farther. In Latin America, even allies measured the gap between American power and American judgment. The Kremlin watched a young president taste failure and took notes about nerve. Havana's victory drew Cuba tight against Moscow and brought Soviet weapons in heavier numbers. The road from Zapata's swamps led within a year to missiles in October, and a cliff-edge crisis the world still marked as the closest it had come to nuclear war. In American uniforms, pilots who had flown those last sorties asked to be forgotten. Some were buried quiet. In prison yards, the captured brigadistas counted months until Washington and Havana made their grim bargain. Food and medicine for men, and families pressed photographs to glass when the buses finally rolled. The post-mortem filled shelves. Analysts underlined the reef, the canceled strike, the faith that a people would rise at the sound of other men's guns. They circled the line that said there had been too much hope and too little skepticism. They wrote about groupthink before the word became a seminar slide. They wrote, too, about courage, small boats rowing into surf, men loading guns by feel, a radio operator reading his last message in a voice steady as a metronome. They noted the banal mechanics that had done as much damage as enemy fire, time zones that muddled rendezvous, fuel that ran short, crates marked wrong, a reef no memo moved. History later tried on tidy morals, and most of them pinched. The invasion had not failed because a single decision cut a wire. It failed because the plan demanded that luck behave and that politics blink. It assumed a dictatorship would crack in hours, and that a superpower could pretend not to be present when everyone already knew. It asked men on a beach to carry the weight of wishful thinking. They did what they could, and then more than that. And still the tide rode its line. What remained, even for those who believed the cause had been just, was a picture of risk mispriced. In fogged rooms, maps had seemed to obey hands. On a real coast, patched fishing boats, coral heads, and a road through swamp obeyed themselves. Exiles paid with blood and with years, and a president paid with a lesson that made him harder a season later, when the world looked down the barrel of nuclear war. The Bay of Pigs did not decide the century, but it changed the way the United States decided. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.